Sometimes the right thing costs everything you have, and sometimes a stranger is the only one willing to pay that price. In a small frontier town, a terrified woman begs a mountain man named Boone Thrasher to save her sister from 3 armed men. Boone walks into that saloon and fights all 3 until they hit the floor. The next morning, the richest man in the territory rides into town demanding Boone hand the girl over. Boone refuses. Now he stands between power and innocence, knowing this choice might be his last. What happens when one man decides mercy matters more than survival? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dry Creek wasn't much to look at, even by frontier standards. The town squatted in a shallow valley where the foothills began their climb toward the distant peaks, a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to lean into each other for support against the constant wind. Dust coated everything, the boardwalks, the hitching posts, the faces of the men who stood in doorways watching strangers pass. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear, or to start over, or because they'd run out of anywhere else to go. The main street stretched perhaps 200 yards from the livery stable at the north end to the church at the south, though the church hadn't seen a proper preacher in more than a year. Between those 2 landmarks sat the general store, the saloon, the boarding house, the blacksmith's forge, and a handful of other establishments that kept the town breathing. Above it all, like a dark cloud that never quite moved on, loomed the shadow of the Blackwood Ranch. Cyrus Blackwood owned most of the valley and a good portion of the territory beyond. His cattle grazed on 10,000 acres. His brand marked half the horses in 3 counties. His money kept the wheels of commerce turning, and his influence reached into every corner of territorial politics. The people of Dry Creek knew better than to cross Cyrus Blackwood. They'd seen what happened to those who tried. Boone Thrasher rode into town on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the aspens on the mountainsides had begun their turn to gold. He led a pack mule loaded with beaver pelts and the kind of solitude that clung to a man who'd spent the summer alone in high country. Boone was 43 years old, though the mountains had added a few extra years to his face. His beard was more gray than brown now, and his eyes held the watchful quality of someone who'd learned that trouble usually announced itself quietly, if at all. He'd been coming to Dry Creek twice a year for the past 5 years, always in spring and fall, always to trade his furs and resupply before heading back into the wilderness. He never stayed more than 2 days. He never caused trouble. The townsfolk knew his face but not his story, which was exactly how Boone preferred it. The general store sat on the east side of the street, its false front painted a faded red that might have been cheerful once. Boone tied his horse and mule to the rail outside and stepped onto the boardwalk, his boots loud in the morning quiet. Through the window, he could see someone moving inside, arranging goods on shelves. The door creaked as he pushed it open. The interior was dim after the brightness outside, and it took his eyes a moment to adjust. The store smelled of coffee and leather, and the dry goods scent of fabric bolts stacked along one wall. Behind the counter stood a young woman with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun. She looked up as he entered, and Boone saw her posture shift almost imperceptibly, the way a deer might when it catches human scent on the wind. "Morning," Boone said, removing his hat. "I've got furs to trade." The woman's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Mr. Thrasher," she said, and Boone was surprised she remembered his name. "Mr. Morrison is in the back. I'll fetch him for you." She disappeared through a doorway behind the counter, and Boone stood there studying the orderly shelves. Everything was clean, well organized, arranged with a care that spoke of someone who took pride in their work. It was different from his previous visits, when old Morrison had run the place with bachelor chaos. The woman returned with Morrison, a gray-haired man in his 60s who'd been trading goods in Dry Creek since before the town had a name. "Boone," Morrison said, extending his hand. "Good to see you made it down before the snow flies." They shook hands and began the familiar dance of negotiation. Boone's pelts were prime quality, and Morrison knew it. Within 20 minutes they'd settled on a fair price, part in cash and part in supplies. As Morrison tallied the figures in his ledger, Boone found his attention drawn back to the young woman who had resumed her work straightening merchandise. "Morrison," Boone said quietly, "when did you hire help?" Morrison glanced up, then over at the woman, and something complicated passed across his face. "That's Clara Ashford. Her and her sister Emma work here. Good people. Hard workers." He said it with emphasis, as if the words meant more than their surface suggested. Before Boone could respond, the door opened, and a younger girl entered, probably 17 or 18, with the same auburn hair as Clara but a softer, more delicate build. She carried a crate of canned goods, struggling slightly with the weight. "Here, let me," Clara said, moving quickly to help her. Together, they set the crate on the counter. "Thank you," the younger girl said, and Boone heard the slight breathlessness in her voice, saw how her eyes darted toward the window as if checking the street beyond. "Emma," Clara said gently, "why don't you start on the inventory in the storeroom?" Emma nodded and disappeared into the back, moving with the quick steps of someone eager to be out of sight. Clara watched her go, and in that moment, Boone saw something he recognized, had seen it before in other times and places. It was the look of someone standing guard, someone protecting something precious. Morrison cleared his throat. "Your supplies will be ready within the hour, Boone." "You staying at the boarding house?" "Plan to," Boone said. "Head out tomorrow morning." "Mrs. Chen will fix you up proper," Morrison said. But there was a distraction in his voice now, and he kept glancing toward the back room where Emma had gone. Boone gathered his immediate purchases and left the store, filing away the small mysteries he'd observed. It wasn't his business. He'd learned long ago that getting involved in other people's troubles was a sure way to acquire troubles of your own. He had enough of those already, tucked away in his past where he preferred them to stay. The boarding house was run by a Chinese widow named Mrs. Chen, who'd followed her husband west 20 years before. She kept clean rooms and asked no questions, which made her establishment popular with the kind of men who valued privacy. Boone secured a room, stowed his gear, and walked back out into the afternoon sun. The town was beginning to stir with the day's business. A blacksmith's hammer rang against an anvil. 2 ranch hands led their horses toward the livery. Outside the saloon, a group of men lounged in chairs, tilted back against the wall, watching the street with the bored attention of those who had nowhere else to be. Boone recognized the type. Ranch hands, probably taking a day's wages and stretching it as far as the whiskey would allow. They watched him pass with casual interest, the way men do when measuring whether someone might be trouble or entertainment. Boone kept his eyes forward and his pace steady. He'd learned that the best way to avoid a fight was to look like someone not worth fighting. He spent the afternoon seeing to his animals, getting a new shoe on his horse, and picking up the last of his supplies. By evening, he was ready to leave at first light. He'd done what he came to do. By this time tomorrow, he'd be halfway back to his cabin in the high country, where the only sounds were wind in the pines and the occasional scream of an eagle overhead. That was the plan, anyway. But plans had a way of changing in places like Dry Creek. Boone took his dinner at the boarding house, sitting alone at a corner table while Mrs. Chen's daughter served him venison stew and fresh bread. Through the window, he could see the main street settling into evening. Lamps were being lit. The saloon was filling up. Somewhere a dog barked, and a child's laughter carried on the cooling air. It was a peaceful scene, ordinary and unremarkable. But Boone had spent too many years reading the currents beneath still water. Something in this town was wound tight, waiting to snap. He could feel it the way he could feel weather coming before the first clouds appeared. He finished his meal and went upstairs to his room, where he cleaned his rifle and checked his ammunition out of long habit. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out over the street. Boone sat by that window as the last light faded from the sky, watching the town below and thinking about a young woman's frightened eyes and the way her sister stood guard. None of his business, he reminded himself. He'd be gone in the morning. But something told him morning was going to look different than he expected. The scream cut through the evening air like a knife. Boone was on his feet before his conscious mind had registered the sound, his hand already reaching for the rifle propped against the wall. He moved to the window and looked down at the street below. Twilight had deepened into early darkness, and the pools of lamplight from the storefronts only made the shadows between them darker. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then movement near the livery stable caught his eye, 3 men and someone smaller struggling between them. Even from this distance, even in the poor light, Boone could see it was a woman. The torn fabric of her dress caught a glint of lamplight as she tried to pull away. More movement, this time from the direction of the general store. Another woman running, her voice rising above the general murmur of the evening. "Stop. Please, someone help her. Please." The running woman was Clara Ashford, and the one being held by the 3 men was her sister Emma. Boone watched as Clara ran desperately down the boardwalk, her calls for help echoing off the false front buildings. Doors remained closed. Men who'd been standing outside the saloon moments before had melted back inside. Even the street itself seemed to empty, as if the town was holding its breath and looking away. The 3 men were dragging Emma toward their horses now. She fought them, her fear giving her a wild strength, but they were bigger, stronger, and practiced at this kind of work. One of them, a tall man with a scarred face, visible even in the dim light, grabbed her roughly by the arm and twisted it behind her back. Emma cried out in pain. Clara had stopped in the middle of the street, spinning in circles, her desperation palpable even from Boone's high vantage point. "Please," she shouted to the empty doorways, to the shadows where she knew people were watching. "Someone help us, please." No one moved, no one answered. Boone stood at his window, his rifle in his hands, watching a scene he'd witnessed too many times before in too many different places. Power and helplessness, playing out their ancient dance. The strong taking what they wanted while the weak looked away. It was the way of the world, had been since Cain and Abel, would be long after Boone Thrasher was dust. None of his business. He'd left that world behind, left the badge and the responsibility and the weight of other people's troubles. He'd earned his solitude, his peace. He'd paid for it with years of his life and pieces of his soul. Below, Emma stumbled and fell to her knees. The scarred man yanked her back to her feet with such force that Boone heard her cry even through the closed window. Clara was still turning in the street, her voice breaking now. "Please, anyone, please." Boone closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, he saw other scenes, other places. A judge taking money to let a killer walk free, a sheriff looking the other way while innocent people suffered. The slow, grinding machinery of corruption that turned justice into just another commodity to be bought and sold. That was why he'd left. Because fighting that machine had been like trying to stop a river with his bare hands. He opened his eyes. Clara was running now, not toward her sister but away, still searching for help that wouldn't come. She was heading toward the boarding house, toward the last few buildings before the town ran out. The 3 men had Emma at their horses now. One of them was tying her hands. She was crying, begging them to let her go. The scarred man laughed, said something that made the others join in. Boone set his rifle back against the wall. He picked up his hat and settled it on his head. His hands were steady, his heartbeat calm. He'd made his decision, though he couldn't have said exactly when. Maybe when Emma fell. Maybe when Clara's voice broke. Maybe 30 years ago, when his father pinned a deputy's star on a young man's chest and told him that some things mattered more than safety. He walked down the stairs and out the front door of the boarding house. Clara nearly ran into him. She pulled up short, her eyes wild in the lamplight, her face streaked with tears. For a moment she just stared at him, this stranger she'd met only that morning. Then recognition flickered across her features. "Please," she said, and her voice was raw. "Sir, please help her. They're taking my sister. Please." Boone looked past her to where the three men were preparing to mount their horses. Emma was tied to the saddle of the middle horse, still struggling but with less energy now, her hope fading. "Who are they?" Boone asked quietly. "Blackwood's men," Clara said. "They work for Cyrus Blackwood. He wants her. He's wanted her for months. Please, if they take her to his ranch." Her voice broke. "Please." Boone nodded once. "Stay here," he said. He walked past her, his boots loud on the boardwalk, then quieter as he stepped down into the dirt street. The three men had their backs to him, focused on securing Emma and their gear. Boone covered half the distance before the scarred man sensed something and turned. "Help you with something, old man?" the scarred man said. He was younger than Boone by a decade, maybe more, and he said it with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never met real consequence. "Let the girl go," Boone said. The other two men turned now, their hands moving reflexively toward their guns. But they didn't draw. Not yet. They were sizing him up, this stranger with grey in his beard and trail dust on his clothes. "This ain't your concern," the scarred man said. "Girl's coming with us. Mr. Blackwood's orders." "Seems like the girl doesn't want to go," Boone observed. "Don't much matter what she wants." The scarred man took a step toward Boone, his chest puffed out. "Mr. Blackwood wants her at the ranch. We're taking her to the ranch. Now you can walk away and keep your teeth, or you can make this difficult." "I'm going to give you one more chance," Boone said, his voice still quiet, still calm. "Let her go. Ride out of here. Tell your boss you couldn't find her." The scarred man's face split into a grin. "Boys," he said to his companions, "I think this old mountain man needs a lesson in how things work around here." He swung without warning, a big looping punch aimed at Boone's jaw. Boone saw it coming the way you see a storm building on the horizon. He stepped inside the swing, caught the man's arm, and used his own momentum to drive him face first into the hitching post. The crack of impact echoed off the buildings. The other two men rushed him together. Boone met the first one with an elbow to the solar plexus that folded him over, then swept his legs out from under him. The second man got his hands on Boone's coat, tried to throw him, but Boone was rooted like an old pine. He broke the man's grip, delivered two quick punches to the ribs, then a third to the side of the head that sent him stumbling backward. The scarred man was back up now, blood streaming from his broken nose. He'd drawn a knife, a long blade that caught the lamplight. "I'm gonna gut you," he snarled. Boone watched the knife, watched the man's eyes, watched the small tells that announced intention before action. The scarred man lunged, blade leading. Boone sidestepped, grabbed the knife arm, and twisted. Something in the man's wrist made a sound like green wood snapping. The knife fell into the dust. What followed wasn't elegant. It was the kind of fighting that broke furniture and bones, the kind that left men groaning in the dirt. Boone took hits. His lip split. His ribs sang with pain from a kick he couldn't quite avoid. But he'd been in harder fights, against meaner men, and he'd survived those too. When it was over, all three of Blackwood's men were down. The scarred man was unconscious, his face pressed against the dirt. The other two were conscious but not interested in continuing the conversation. Boone stood over them, breathing hard, his knuckles raw and bleeding. The street was no longer empty. People had emerged from doorways and shadows, drawn by the sound of violence. They stood in a loose circle, watching in stunned silence. Boone walked to the horse where Emma was tied. He cut her bonds with the scarred man's own knife. She collapsed against him, sobbing, and he caught her awkwardly, unsure. What to do with this frightened girl who smelled of fear and general store soap? Clara was there then, taking her sister, holding her close. "Thank you," she said to Boone, her eyes bright with tears. "Thank you." Boone nodded. He looked at the three men on the ground, then at the crowd that had gathered. Old Pete from the saloon was there, and Morrison from the general store, and a dozen others. They were looking at him differently now, some with gratitude, some with fear, all of them understanding the same thing. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Doc Wheeler sank into the chair Boone had vacated, suddenly looking every one of his 60-some years. He set his medical bag on the floor and rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man carrying a weight too long. 2 years ago, he began, Blackwood brought a young woman to my office. Said she was a maid who'd taken a fall down the stairs at his ranch. Broken arm, bruised ribs, cuts and contusions all over. She was maybe 20 years old. Clara's hand tightened on Emma's shoulder. Boone leaned against the wall, listening. I set her arm and bandaged her ribs, gave her laudanum for the pain. The whole time, she wouldn't look at me, wouldn't speak, just stared at the wall like she'd gone somewhere far away in her head. Doc Wheeler's voice was hollow. Blackwood stayed in the room the entire time, watching, making sure she said nothing. I realize now. What happened to her? Clara asked, though her voice suggested she already knew. She came back 3 more times over the next 6 months. Different injuries, same explanation. Falls, accidents, clumsiness. The last time was January, middle of winter. Blackwood said she'd slipped on ice and hit her head, brought her in, wrapped in blankets. The doctor's hands were shaking now. She died 2 days later, never regained consciousness. The room was silent, except for the sound of Emma's breathing and the distant call of an owl outside. I wrote accidental death on the certificate, Doc Wheeler continued. I knew it was a lie, we all knew, but Blackwood owned the town, then same as now. The sheriff called it a tragedy. The judge offered condolences. She was buried in the town cemetery with a marker that doesn't even have her full name on it. Just Sarah, beloved servant. I don't think anyone ever asked where her family was if she had people who should be told. Why are you telling us this now? Boone asked quietly. Doc Wheeler looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. Because I've lived with that shame for 2 years. Because every time I see Blackwood in town, I think about that girl and how I failed her. Because when I heard what happened tonight, I thought... His voice broke. I thought, here it is again. Another young woman, another rich man who thinks he can take whatever he wants, and I'll be patching up the damage and writing death certificates and carrying more shame. Not this time, Boone said. You can't stop him, the doctor said, but there was desperate hope in his voice. He'll come with 20 men, 30 if he needs to. He'll burn this building down if that's what it takes. Then we don't stay in the building. Clara stood up carefully, making sure not to disturb Emma. What are you saying? Boone moved to the window, looking out at the sleeping town. An idea was forming, still rough, but taking shape. Blackwood wants Emma. He'll come for her at dawn, expecting to find us here, expecting us to be frightened and trapped. What if we're not here? We run, Clara said, like I suggested before. No. Running just means he chases you. A man like Blackwood, he'll chase you to the ends of the earth if that's what his pride demands. Boone turned from the window. We need to change the game. Make him come to us on ground we choose. I don't understand. The mountains, Boone said. I know every trail, every pass, every place where one man with a rifle can hold off a dozen. We leave before dawn, take the high route. Let Blackwood follow if he wants, but he'll be following into country where his money and influence don't mean anything. Doc Wheeler was nodding slowly. It might work. The high country is harsh this time of year, especially for men not used to it. Blackwood's cowboys are ranch hands, not mountain men. But we'd be trapped up there, Clara said. Eventually we'd have to come down, and he'd be waiting. Maybe, Boone allowed, or maybe we stay up there long enough that other solutions present themselves. Maybe we get word to the territorial marshal in Salt Creek. Maybe Blackwood loses interest when he realizes the chase will cost him more than the prize is worth. You don't believe that last part, Clara said, reading his face. No, Boone admitted, but I believe we have a better chance up there than down here. And I believe that not fighting on ground your enemy chooses is half the battle. There was a knock at the door, soft but urgent. Boone's hand went to his rifle, but Doc Wheeler stood. "That'll be Jake Cordell." I asked him to come. "Who's Jake Cordell?" Boone asked. "Deputy," the doctor said, moving to open the door, "and possibly the only honest lawman in 3 territories." The man who entered was young, maybe 25, with the lean build of someone who worked hard and ate little. He wore a deputy's badge on his vest, but there was something uncomfortable about the way he carried it, like it was someone else's clothes. "Doc," he said, nodding to Wheeler. Then his eyes found Boone. "You're the one who fought Blackwood's men." "I am." Jake Cordell moved into the room, checking the hallway before closing the door. "I need to tell you something. Something I saw at the sheriff's office tonight." "Go on," Boone said. The deputy reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. His hands were shaking slightly as he opened it on the bed, smoothing the creases. It was ornate, official-looking, with seals and signatures at the bottom. "Marriage certificate," Jake said. "Dated 2 months ago. Says Emma Ashford and Cyrus Blackwood were married in a ceremony at his ranch, witnessed by the judge and the sheriff." Clara gasped. Emma, still sleeping, didn't stir. Boone moved closer, studying the document. "It's a forgery," Clara said. "Emma's never been to his ranch. She's never signed anything." "I know," Jake said, "but it's good enough to hold up in any territorial court. Blackwood's judge friend will swear he performed the ceremony. The sheriff will swear he witnessed it, unless someone can prove otherwise. This document says Emma is legally Blackwood's wife, which means when he comes for her tomorrow," Doc Wheeler said slowly, "he won't be kidnapping her. He'll be retrieving his runaway wife." The implications settled over them like a cold fog. Even if they ran, even if they made it to the territorial marshal, Blackwood had a legal claim. And the law, that thing Boone had once believed in and then abandoned, would be on Blackwood's side. "Where did you get this?" Boone asked. "Sheriff Hastings had it in his desk." "I was looking for—" Jake stopped. Seemed to decide honesty was the only option. "I was looking for evidence, something to prove what Blackwood really is. I've only been deputy for 6 months, but that was enough to see how things work around here. The sheriff takes money from Blackwood, the judge takes money from Blackwood, half the town council takes money from Blackwood, and I just watch and write reports nobody reads and try to tell myself I'm doing some good." "You're doing good now," Clara said softly. "Maybe. Or maybe I just found one more way we're going to lose." Jake looked at the marriage certificate. "Even if you get away, even if you stay away forever, Blackwood can use this document to seize any property Emma owns, claim any inheritance, even prosecute you for aiding and abetting a runaway wife. The law is his weapon, and it's a better weapon than any gun." Boone stared at the document, at the elaborate lie written in official script. He thought about all the times he'd seen the law twisted, seen justice bent to serve power. This was why he'd left civilization, why he'd retreated to the mountains, where the rules were cleaner, harsher, but at least honest. "Can you get us other papers from that desk?" Boone asked. Jake blinked. "What?" "The sheriff's desk. If he has this marriage certificate, what else does he have? Records of payments? Other forged documents? Evidence of Blackwood's dealings?" The deputy's eyes widened as he understood. "You want to expose him?" "I want leverage," Boone said. "Right now, Blackwood holds all the cards. He has the law, the money, the men. We need something that makes him think twice, something that costs him if he pushes too hard." "That's dangerous," Doc Wheeler said. "If the sheriff catches Jake, if we do nothing, Emma dies, or wishes she had," Boone said, flatly. "Maybe Clara, too. Maybe everyone in this room. We're past the point of safe choices." Jake Cordell stood straighter, and something shifted in his bearing. "There's a folder." Locked in the bottom drawer. I've seen the sheriff open it when he thinks no one's watching. He looks at whatever's inside like it's worth more than gold. Can you get it? I can try. Sheriff Hastings is at the saloon, usually stays there until past midnight. If I go now, he looked at each of them in turn, if I get caught, it won't be pretty. Then don't get caught, Boone said. Jake nodded once, sharp and decisive. He moved to the door, then paused and looked back at Emma, still sleeping peacefully in her sister's lap. My sister was 14 when a rich rancher decided he wanted her. My parents tried to stop it, but he had the law on his side. He married her, legal as could be. She died a year later, and the doctor said it was childbirth complications, but I saw the bruises. His jaw tightened. I became a lawman because I thought I could stop men like that. I haven't been able to yet, but maybe tonight I can make a start. He left without waiting for a response, moving quickly and quietly down the stairs. Doc Wheeler let out a long breath. He's a good kid. I hope we haven't just gotten him killed. We're all taking that chance, Boone said. He looked at Clara. You should rest while you can. We'll need to move fast when the time comes. I won't be able to sleep. Then rest anyway. Close your eyes and breathe. Let your body recover, even if your mind can't. Clara nodded slowly. She lay down next to Emma, curling protectively around her sister. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed her, her breathing evening out into the rhythm of sleep. Boone returned to his position by the window. Doc Wheeler settled into the chair, his medical bag at his feet, ready for whatever injuries the dawn might bring. They didn't have to wait long for Jake to return. The leather folder that Jake Cordell laid on the bed was old and worn, the kind of thing a man kept for documents that mattered. The lock on it had been forced, the brass mechanism bent but functional. Jake's hands were steadier now, the action seeming to have settled something in him. Sheriff was passed out drunk at his corner table. Jake said, Pete helped me, kept anyone from going near the office while I worked. What's inside? Boone asked. Jake opened the folder carefully, spreading the contents across the bed. There were dozens of papers, some official-looking with seals and signatures, others just handwritten notes on cheap paper. But each one told a story of corruption that ran deeper than Boone had imagined. Land deeds, Jake said, pointing to a stack of documents. 23 properties that Blackwood acquired over the past 5 years. Every one of them shows the owner selling for a fraction of fair value. And look at the dates, most of them sold within a week of some accident or misfortune befalling the owner. Doc Wheeler leaned in, studying the papers. I remember some of these. Sam Pritchard, his barn burned down 3 days before he sold his ranch to Blackwood. The fire supposedly started from a lightning strike, but there hadn't been a storm in weeks. And this one, Jake continued, pulling out another document. Martha Hendricks sold her property 2 days after her son had his leg broken in a wagon accident. She needed money for his medical care, and Blackwood was there with cash in hand and a contract ready to sign. Convenient accidents, Boone observed. There's more. Jake sorted through the papers, pulling out a ledger. Payment records. Monthly payments to the sheriff, the judge, the territorial land office clerk, even the newspaper editor, everyone who could make trouble or prevent trouble, all of them on Blackwood's payroll. Clara had woken and moved to look at the documents. This is enough, isn't it? Enough to bring him down? Maybe, Boone said. If we can get it to someone who matters, someone beyond Blackwood's reach. The territorial governor, Jake suggested. He's in Salt Creek, 2 days hard ride from here. He's had run-ins with Blackwood before, tried to investigate some land deals. Blackwood's influence doesn't extend that far. 2 days, Boone repeated, thinking. Blackwood will come at dawn. That's maybe 5 hours from now. Even if we leave immediately, we'll never outrun him with both sisters, Doc Wheeler finished. Not to Salt Creek. Blackwood's men know this country. They'll have fresh horses, and they'll be able to move faster than a group. The room fell silent as they grappled with the problem. They had evidence that could destroy Blackwood, but no way to get it where it needed to go before Blackwood destroyed them. "I'll take it," Jake said suddenly. "I can ride hard, change horses at ranches along the way. I'll make Salt Creek in a day and a half if I push." "Blackwood will send men after you," Boone said. "Then I'll have to ride faster than they do." Jake's jaw was set, determined. "This is what I became a lawman for. Let me do this." Boone studied the young deputy, seeing something he recognized, the same idealism that had driven him 30 years ago, before the compromises and corruption had worn it away. Part of him wanted to warn Jake, to tell him that carrying that folder to Salt Creek wouldn't fix everything, that the rot ran deeper than any evidence could prove. But another part of him, a part he'd thought long dead, wanted to believe that maybe this time could be different. "You'll need help," Clara said. She stood, moving away from Emma. "I can ride. I know the country between here and Salt Creek. If we split up, take different routes, one of us will make it through." "No," Boone said immediately. "Why not? Emma needs you here to protect her. She doesn't need both of us. And this is bigger than just Emma now. If we can bring Blackwood down, we save not just my sister but everyone else he might hurt in the future." "She's right," Doc Wheeler said quietly. "This is about more than Emma. That girl who died 2 years ago, she matters too, and all the other people Blackwood has crushed over the years. They deserve justice." Boone wanted to argue, wanted to say that justice was a luxury they couldn't afford when survival was on the line. But he looked at Clara's face, at the determination there, and realized she'd already made her choice. And maybe she was right. Maybe sometimes you had to risk everything for the chance at something better. "If you go," Boone said to Clara, "you follow Jake's lead. You do what he says when he says it. No arguments, agreed. And you," Boone turned to Jake, "you keep her safe. That's your first priority, even above getting the evidence to the governor. You understand?" Jake nodded solemnly. "I understand." They spent the next hour planning routes and timing. Jake would take the main road, moving fast and visible, likely drawing pursuit. Clara would take the mountain route, slower but less obvious, carrying duplicate copies of the most important documents. If one of them was caught, the other might still get through. Doc Wheeler provided supplies, dried meat, hardtack, a flask of water for each of them. He also gave them laudanum and bandages, understanding that the ride ahead might cost them. As they prepared to leave, Emma woke. She looked around in confusion, then fear when she saw the preparations. "What's happening?" Clara went to her, kneeling beside the bed. "I need to leave for a little while. Mr. Thrasher will stay with you, keep you safe." "No," Emma said, gripping her sister's hand. "Don't go. Please. I have to. This is how we stop Blackwood. This is how we make sure you're truly safe, not just for today, but forever." Clara stroked her sister's hair, her voice gentle but firm. "You're braver than you know, Emma. You showed that tonight, and I need you to be brave a little longer. What if something happens to you? Then you'll have Boone and Doc Wheeler, and you'll remember that you're an Ashford, and Ashfords don't quit." Clara kissed her sister's forehead. "I'll be back before you know it. I promise." It was a promise she had no right to make, but Emma needed to hear it. They all did. Jake and Clara left through the back of the boarding house just as the sky began to lighten in the east. Not dawn yet, but close. Boone watched them go from the window, 2 figures on horseback disappearing into the grey pre-dawn light, carrying with them the only real hope any of them had. Then he checked his rifle, counted his ammunition, and prepared to hold off whatever came with the sunrise. Emma sat on the bed, hugging her knees to her chest. Doc Wheeler had settled back into his chair, his medical bag at the ready, and outside, the town of Dry Creek held its breath and waited to see which way the wind would blow. Dawn came, slowly to Dry Creek, the sun rising reluctantly behind the mountains, as if it too wanted no part of what was coming. Boone had moved Emma and Doc Wheeler to a better defensive position, a storage room at the back of the boarding house with only one door and a small window that overlooked the alley. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than being trapped in a room with windows facing the street. Mrs. Chen had brought coffee and bread before retreating to her own quarters. "Whatever happens," she'd said to Boone, "you did a good thing. Remember that." Now Boone stood at the front window of the building's upper hallway, watching the street. The town was stirring, but slowly, people emerging to begin their day with the careful movements of those who knew trouble was coming and wanted to be ready to duck when it arrived. The sound of hoofbeats came first, distant but growing louder. Many horses, moving at a steady pace. Boone counted them by sound 15, maybe 20. Enough to make the point that resistance was futile. They came around the bend in the road, just as the sun cleared the mountain peaks, and Boone got his first good look at Cyrus Blackwood in daylight. The man was everything the stories suggested and more. He rode a magnificent black stallion, with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle. His clothes were expensive but practical: black pants, white shirt, black vest, all of it tailored to fit him perfectly. He wore a silver watch chain across his vest, and even from a distance Boone could see the glint of gold on his right hand. But it was Blackwood's face that held Boone's attention, handsome in a severe way, with sharp features and cold eyes that missed nothing. This was not a man who made idle threats. This was not a man who accepted defiance. Behind Blackwood rode his men, a mix of ranch hands and harder types. The kind of men who did whatever work needed doing and didn't ask questions about legality or morality. They spread out as they entered town, taking positions that cut off escape routes and established control. The town itself seemed to shrink before them. Doors closed, windows were shuttered. Even the dogs slunk into alleys and fell silent. Blackwood stopped in the center of the street, directly in front of the boarding house. He didn't dismount. Instead, he pulled out a gold pocket watch, checked the time with deliberate care, then spoke in a voice that carried easily in the morning air. "I'm looking for a man named Boone Thrasher. I'm told he's staying in this establishment." Boone moved to the front door and stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. "You found him." Blackwood's eyes settled on Boone, studying him with the intensity of a man evaluating livestock. "Mr. Thrasher, I understand you had an altercation with some of my men last night. Your men were manhandling a young woman. I suggested they stop." "Suggested," Blackwood repeated, and a thin smile crossed his face. "My men are in the care of a doctor this morning. One has a broken wrist, another a broken nose. The third can barely see through the swelling around his eyes. That's quite a suggestion." "They're alive," Boone said, "which is more than they deserved." The smile disappeared. "That young woman you so gallantly defended is my wife. She ran away from our home 3 months ago, and I've been searching for her ever since. Last night's incident was simply my men attempting to retrieve my runaway bride and bring her safely home." "That's a lie," Boone said flatly. "Is it?" Blackwood reached into his jacket and pulled out a document. Even folded, Boone recognized it, the same marriage certificate Jake had shown them hours earlier. "This says otherwise. Signed, sealed, and legally binding. Emma Ashford became Emma Blackwood in a ceremony performed by Judge Morrison at my ranch. The good judge is prepared to testify to that fact, as is your own Sheriff Hastings, who witnessed the ceremony. Strange that the bride doesn't remember her own wedding. My wife suffers from nervous episodes. Sometimes her memory is unreliable." Blackwood's voice was smooth, reasonable, the tone of a concerned husband. "It's one of the reasons I'm so worried about her. She needs proper care, the kind I can provide at my ranch." Boone felt his jaw tighten. It was a perfect trap, legally constructed and impossible to escape. Blackwood had thought of everything, bought everyone necessary, prepared for every contingency. The marriage certificate was just the beginning. "I've come here today not looking for trouble," Blackwood continued, "but for a simple resolution. Return my wife to me, and we can forget last night's unpleasantness. You can ride back to your mountains, and everyone in this town can go about their business. I'm a reasonable man, Mr. Thrasher. I don't hold grudges when conflicts can be resolved peacefully. And if I refuse? Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something cold moved behind his eyes. Then you're interfering with a legal marriage, aiding and abetting a runaway wife, and assaulting lawmen in the performance of their duties. Sheriff Hastings will be forced to arrest you. And should you resist that arrest, he gestured to the armed men surrounding him, well, accidents happen. It was beautifully done, Boone had to admit. Blackwood had turned the entire situation around, made himself the victim and Boone the criminal. Even if Boone somehow survived this confrontation, he'd be hunted as an outlaw. And Emma would still end up at Blackwood's ranch, legally his property, with no one able to help her. I need to think about this, Boone said. Of course. I'm a patient man. Blackwood pulled out his pocket watch again, checking it with exaggerated care. I'll give you until noon. That's 3 hours to consider your options and make the sensible choice. After noon, he let the sentence hang, the threat implicit. Blackwood turned his horse and rode to the hotel across the street, his men following. They took over the building, settling in like an occupying force. The message was clear. They weren't leaving without Emma. Boone returned inside, his mind racing. The plan had been to hold out until Jake and Clara could reach Salt Creek, until the evidence against Blackwood could be delivered to the territorial governor. But that would take at least another day, probably longer. And Blackwood had given them 3 hours. Doc Wheeler met him in the hallway. I heard. He's got everything lined up. The certificate, the witnesses, the legal authority. Even if we prove it's all a lie, that'll take weeks or months. By then, Emma will be dead, the doctor finished. Like Sarah, they stood in the hallway, 2 men who'd seen too much and failed too often, facing a situation that seemed to have no solution. Then Emma's voice came from behind them, quiet but steady. I'll go with him. Boone turned to find Emma standing in the doorway of the storage room. She looked small and frightened, but there was something new in her face, a kind of resigned courage that broke Boone's heart. I'll go with him, she repeated. That's the only way to stop this. If I go willingly, he'll leave. The town will be safe. Clara will be safe. You'll be safe. No, Boone said. It's the only way. There's always another way. Not this time. Emma's voice was firm despite the tears on her cheeks. I've been running from this for months. Maybe if I stop running, if I accept what's going to happen, at least I can control something. At least I can save the people I care about. It was the same logic that had sent thousands of people to their doom throughout history, the idea that surrender might bring mercy, that cooperation might mean survival. Boone had seen it before, had seen where it led. Nothing good waited at the end of that road. Listen to me, Boone said, kneeling so he was at Emma's eye level. Men like Blackwood don't stop when you give them what they want. They just take more. You go with him now. He'll break you piece by piece until there's nothing left. And then he'll move on to the next woman, and the next, because that's what men like him do. Then what do we do? Emma asked, and the helplessness in her voice was devastating. He has the law. He has the men. He has everything. Boone stood, his mind working through possibilities and finding them all wanting. Then a thought struck him, small at first, but growing larger. The certificate, he said slowly. When did he say the marriage took place? Doc Wheeler pulled out the copy they'd made. 3 months ago, July 15th. And Clara said Blackwood first saw Emma 6 months ago. That's right, Emma confirmed. It was April. He came into the store looking at saddle leather. I remember because it was right after Easter. Boone felt something click into place. So, according to Blackwood's story, he saw you in April, courted you, married you in July, and you ran away immediately after the wedding. That's what he's claiming, Doc Wheeler said. But that means There should be evidence of the courtship, letters, gifts, people who saw you together. A wedding requires preparation, announcements, witnesses beyond just the judge and sheriff, someone to perform the ceremony, a wedding dress. Boone started pacing, the pieces coming together. Blackwood's certificate is legal in form, but it's not backed by any of the normal evidence of a real marriage. It's just a piece of paper. So if Jake and Clara can get that folder to the territorial governor, if they can show the pattern of forgeries and corruption, then Blackwood's marriage certificate becomes just another piece of evidence against him. Not proof of marriage, but proof of fraud. Emma's eyes widened. You think we can prove it's fake? I think we can create enough doubt that no judge will enforce it, especially if we can hold out long enough for the governor to act. Boone looked at Doc Wheeler. How long would it take the governor to send territorial marshals here once he sees the evidence? If Jake reaches him today, marshals could be here by tomorrow evening, maybe sooner if the governor considers it urgent enough. Tomorrow evening, they had to hold out for more than 30 hours. Against 20 armed men, a corrupt sheriff, and a determined adversary with unlimited resources. We can't hold this building that long, Boone said. Too many weak points, too many ways they can get to us. Then where? Boone moved to the window, looking out at the town, at the mountains beyond. An idea was forming, dangerous and desperate, but possibly their only chance. The church, he said. The church? Doc Wheeler frowned. It hasn't been used in over a year. The roof leaks, it's stone, built to last, only one entrance, and it's solid oak, small windows too high to climb through easily. And it's on the south end of town, away from Blackwood's position. He'll just surround it, lay siege. Let him. A siege buys us time. And time is what we need. They stood there, 3 people planning rebellion against overwhelming odds, hoping that somewhere 2 riders were making better progress than seemed possible. The sun climbed higher. The town held its breath. And in the hotel across the street, Cyrus Blackwood waited with the patience of a man who'd never lost before and couldn't imagine starting now. They moved quickly but carefully, using the back alleys and the buildings themselves for cover. Emma, Boone, and Doc Wheeler, making their way south through a town that watched from behind closed shutters but offered no direct help. Mrs. Chen had provided canvas bags with food and water, pressing them into Boone's hands with a look that said more than words could. The church stood at the end of the street, a simple stone structure built by hopeful settlers who'd believed Dry Creek would grow into something more than it had. The stones had come from the mountains, hauled down by wagon and ox, fitted together by a stonemason who died 5 years back. The roof was cedar shake, weathered but still sound despite what Doc Wheeler had said. The door was oak, 3 inches thick, with iron hinges that had been forged by the town's first blacksmith. It was, Boone realized as they approached, exactly what they needed. "How do we get in without Blackwood seeing?" Emma asked. "We don't," Boone said. "We go in the front door, bold as you please. By the time he realizes what we're doing, we'll be inside with the door barred. And then we wait." They crossed the last stretch of open ground at a run. Boone hit the church door first, throwing his shoulder against it. The door swung inward with a groan of unused hinges. They tumbled inside, and Boone immediately turned to close and bar the door. A heavy wooden beam sat in brackets on either side of the frame, and he dropped it into place with a solid thunk. The interior of the church was dim and dusty, illuminated by narrow windows set high in the stone walls. Pews lined the central aisle, many of them damaged by weather that had found its way through gaps in the roof. At the far end, a simple altar stood beneath a wooden cross. The whole space smelled of abandonment and forgotten prayers. "Check the windows," Boone told Doc Wheeler. "Make sure they're all secure." While the doctor moved through the space, Boone examined their position. The church was maybe 40 feet long and 20 wide, with walls 3 feet thick at the base. The windows were 8 feet off the ground, too high to climb through easily, and narrow enough that a man would have to squeeze to fit. The door was the only real entrance, and it was solid. "Windows are intact," Doc Wheeler reported. "Some cracks in the glass, but nothing large enough to shoot through accurately." "Good." Boone moved to one of the windows on the north side, the one facing back toward the main street. Through it, he could see Blackwood's men beginning to react to their movement. Men were mounting horses, organizing, preparing to respond. Emma sat on one of the pews, her hands clasped in her lap. "What now?" "Now we make them think twice about rushing this place," Boone said. He raised his rifle and fired a single shot through the window, aiming high and wide, not trying to hit anyone, just making a point. The glass shattered, and the crack of the rifle echoed through the valley. The response was immediate. Blackwood's men scattered, taking cover. Someone returned fire, but the shot went wide, thudding into the stone wall harmlessly. "That'll slow them down," Boone said. "They know we're armed and willing to fight. They'll have to approach carefully. How long can we hold out?" Emma asked. "Long as we need to." Boone hoped he sounded more confident than he felt. They had food for maybe 2 days if they rationed. Water for less than that. Ammunition was limited. Boone had brought what he could carry, but it wasn't unlimited. And if Blackwood decided to set fire to the roof, the stone walls wouldn't matter. But those were problems for later. Right now, they'd bought time, and time was precious. Movement in the street caught Boone's attention. A group of men were approaching the church, using the buildings for cover. They moved with military precision, spreading out to surround the structure. 20 men, maybe more, all armed, all taking positions. Then Blackwood himself appeared, still mounted, still calm. He rode to a position about 50 yards from the church door, just out of rifle range, and sat there regarding the building like a man studying a puzzle he was confident he could solve. "Mr. Thrasher," Blackwood called, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "This is foolish. You're trapped in there. We've got food, water, and ammunition," Boone called back. "We can wait as long as we need to." "For what? Rescue? No one is coming to help you. The sheriff is with me. The judge is with me. I own this town. Maybe, but you don't own time. And time is working against you." Blackwood was silent for a moment, and Boone could almost see him working through the implications. "You sent someone to Salt Creek," Blackwood said finally. "That deputy, I'm guessing, maybe Clara Ashford with him." Boone said nothing, which was answer enough. "I have men on all the roads," Blackwood continued. "Fast riders on fresh horses. Your people won't make it. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. But you don't know for certain, do you? And that uncertainty must be eating at you." Another silence. When Blackwood spoke again, his voice had hardened. "You're gambling with your life, Mr. Thrasher, and with the lives of everyone in that church. Is that really what you want? What I want is for you to ride away and leave these people alone. That's not going to happen. Then I guess we're at what they call an impasse." Blackwood wheeled his horse and rode back to his men. Boone watched him go, then turned from the window. Emma was watching him with wide eyes. "Do you really think Clara and Jake will make it?" she asked. "I think they have a chance. Better chance than we'd have trying to outrun Blackwood's men ourselves." Boone moved to check the other windows, making sure they had clear sight lines. "Your sister is smart and determined, and Jake Cordell strikes me as someone who doesn't quit easy. I hope you're right." "So do I." The morning stretched into afternoon. Blackwood's men maintained their positions, but made no attempt to rush the church. Twice, someone fired a shot at the windows, testing their resolve, and twice Boone returned fire, reminding them that approaching the church would be costly. Around midday, old Pete from the saloon approached under a white flag. He stopped 20 yards from the door and called out, "Boone, I've got food and water. Blackwood says you can have it if you'll talk to him." "Leave it there," Boone called back. "We'll talk through the door." Pete set down a basket and retreated. Boone waited 5 minutes, watching for tricks, then cracked the door open just enough to pull the basket inside. It contained bread, cheese, dried meat, and 2 canteens of water. Also, a note. "What does it say?" Doc Wheeler asked. Boone unfolded the paper and read aloud. "Mr. Thrasher, I'm prepared to be reasonable. Emma comes with me, and you and the doctor go free. No charges, no pursuit. This offer expires at sundown. After that, I take what's mine by whatever means necessary." "What will you do?" Emma asked. "Nothing," Boone said. "We stick to the plan, but if he attacks after sundown, then we defend this position as best we can and hope Jake and Clara are moving faster than Blackwood's riders." They ate sparingly, from the food Pete had brought, conserving what Mrs. Chen had packed. Boone positioned himself where he could watch both the door and the window, facing the main street. Doc Wheeler tended to Emma, who was holding up better than Boone had expected. She had her sister's strength, he realized. It just manifested differently. As afternoon gave way to evening, the town began to change. Boone noticed people moving in the streets more than before. Small groups gathering, talking in low voices. Morrison from the general store, Pete from the saloon. A handful of ranch hands who worked the smaller spreads. Even Mrs. Chen, standing on the boardwalk in front of her establishment, arms crossed, watching Blackwood's men with an expression that suggested she'd made up her mind about something. "Doc," Boone said, "what's happening out there?" Wheeler moved to the window and looked out. A slow smile spread across his face. "I think the town is waking up." "What do you mean?" "Look at them. They're not hiding anymore. They're standing in the open, watching, bearing witness." The doctor's voice held wonder. "They're choosing a side." Boone studied the street more carefully. Wheeler was right. The people of Dry Creek were emerging from their homes and businesses, positioning themselves in clear view of Blackwood and his men. They weren't armed. They weren't making threats. They were simply present, refusing to look away. It was the smallest act of defiance, but in a town that had lived under Blackwood's shadow for so long, it was revolutionary. Sheriff Hastings appeared, trying to disperse the crowds, ordering people back to their homes. But no one moved. Old Pete actually laughed in the sheriff's face. Morrison stood his ground when Hastings tried to physically push him. One by one, the townspeople were making their choice. Blackwood rode back into view, his face darker than it had been that morning. He was losing something he'd never lost before the automatic compliance of the people he dominated. They were still afraid of him. Boone could see that. But they were more afraid of what they'd become if they kept looking away. "Looks like your deadline isn't having quite the effect you wanted," Boone called out. Blackwood stared at him, and Boone saw genuine confusion in the man's eyes. He'd bought judges and sheriffs, had acquired land and power, but he'd never understood the one thing that mattered most. People could only be pushed so far before they pushed back, and when they finally did, all the money and influence in the world couldn't stop them. "This changes nothing," Blackwood said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "It changes everything," Boone replied. "And you know it." The sun was setting now, painting the valley in shades of orange and red. In a few minutes, Blackwood's deadline would pass, and they'd find out just how far he was willing to go. Boone checked his rifle, counted his remaining ammunition one more time, and prepared for whatever came next. Behind him, Emma stood at the window, looking out at the people of Dry Creek. "They're standing up for us," she said, wonder in her voice. "They're standing up for themselves," Doc Wheeler corrected. "You just gave them a reason to do it." The last light faded from the sky. Blackwood sat on his horse, surrounded by his men, facing a church full of people he couldn't break and a town that was no longer his. Somewhere in the darkness, 2 riders pushed their horses towards Salt Creek, carrying documents that would either save them all or mean nothing. And in the church, 3 people waited to see which way the night would fall. Blackwood dismounted and walked forward, stopping in the middle of the street with his hands at his sides. His men stayed back, weapons ready but not raised. It was a strange moment of stillness after the violence of the night. "Thrasher," Blackwood called out. "We need to talk." "I'm listening." "This has gone on long enough. You've made your point. The town has seen your stand. But it ends now, one way or another." Blackwood's voice was calm, almost reasonable. "I'm prepared to offer you one final deal. Not interested in your deals. You should be, because the alternative is that I burn that church to the ground with all of you inside it. I have enough men and enough oil to do it, and I've run out of patience." Boone believed him. The desperation was starting to show in Blackwood's voice, the rage of a man who'd never been defied and didn't know how to handle it. "Here's my offer," Blackwood continued. "Emma comes out. You and the doctor go free. Not just free of the building, but free to leave the territory. I'll give you horses, supplies, and a day's head start. You'll never hear from me again. And Emma will be cared for as befits my wife. She'll want for nothing, except her freedom, except her life." Blackwood's jaw tightened. "I'm offering you a way out of this that doesn't end with your death. I suggest you take it." Boone looked back at Emma, who was standing near the altar, her face pale but determined. She met his eyes and shook her head slightly. She'd rather die than surrender to Blackwood. He could see it in her expression, and it broke his heart and filled him with pride in equal measure. "No deal," Boone called back. "Then you've chosen death." Blackwood turned and walked back to his men. Boone watched him give orders, saw the men begin to prepare for a final assault. This would be at overwhelming force, damn the casualties, take the church by storm, and pull Emma out of the wreckage. Boone checked his rifle one more time, said a quiet prayer to a god he wasn't sure existed, and prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Then he heard it. Distant at first, but growing louder. Hoofbeats. Many of them coming fast from the north. Everyone heard it. Blackwood's men paused in their preparations, turning to look. The townspeople who'd maintained their vigil through the night straightened, hope flickering across their faces. Even Blackwood himself turned, his expression shifting from determination to confusion. The riders came around the bend in the road like an answer to prayer. 8 men on horseback, riding hard, and even from a distance Boone could see the glint of badges on their chests. Territorial marshals, and at the front of the group rode Jake Cordell, his face showing the exhaustion of a man who'd ridden through hell to get here. Behind the marshals came Clara Ashford on a lathered horse, barely able to stay in the saddle but refusing to be left behind. She'd made it. They both had. The marshals fanned out as they entered town, rifles drawn, their formation precise and professional. The lead marshal, a grey-haired man with the bearing of someone who'd spent his life enforcing law in hard places, rode straight to Blackwood. "Cyrus Blackwood," the marshal said, his voice carrying authority that didn't need to be loud. "You're under arrest for fraud, extortion, conspiracy to commit murder, and about 20 other charges I'll be happy to detail once we get you to Salt Creek." Blackwood's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, calculation. On what authority? The territorial governor's authority, and backed by about 50 pages of evidence that your corruption runs deeper than a mine shaft. The marshal gestured to his men. "You can come peaceful, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." For a moment, Boone thought Blackwood might fight. The man's hand twitched toward his gun, and his men shifted nervously. But then Blackwood looked around at the marshals with their rifles, at the townspeople watching with undisguised satisfaction, at the church where his prize remained out of reach. He'd lost, and he was smart enough to know it. "This isn't over," Blackwood said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yeah, it is," the marshal replied. "Been over since you started thinking you were above the law." They took Blackwood into Depinan, custody, binding his hands with iron manacles that looked small on a man who'd seemed so large just hours before. Sheriff Hastings tried to slip away, but was caught and cuffed alongside his patron. The judge would be next, the marshal promised. Everyone who'd participated in Blackwood's corruption would face justice. Boone unbarred the church door and stepped out into the morning sun. He was exhausted, smoke-stained, and bleeding from a cut he didn't remember getting. But they'd survived. Against all odds, they'd held out long enough. Clara half fell from her horse and ran to the church, pushing past the marshals. "Emma, is she—" "She's fine," Boone said. "Thanks to you." Emma appeared in the doorway, and the sisters collided in an embrace that seemed to hold all the fear and relief of the past 2 days. They clung to each other, crying, laughing, alive. Jake Cordell dismounted and walked over to Boone, extending his hand. "Hell of a night, I'm guessing." "You could say that." Boone shook the young deputy's hand. "You made good time. Clara knew shortcuts I'd never heard of. And when we reached the governor, showed him those documents—" Jake shook his head. "He called in every favor he had to get these marshals mounted and moving. Said it was about time someone put Blackwood in his place. The town was coming alive now, people emerging fully from their homes, no longer afraid." Old Pete was passing around a bottle from the saloon. Morrison was shaking the marshals' hands and thanking them. Even Doc Wheeler had managed to smile, something Boone hadn't seen before. It was over, really, truly over. Boone looked at Clara, who'd separated from her sister long enough to approach him. She looked like she'd aged years in the past day, but there was something new in her eyes, strength that came from having faced the worst and survived it. "Thank you," she said simply. "You did the hard part," Boone replied. "You rode through the night, got the help we needed. We both did hard things." She smiled slightly. "Seems like we make a good team." Boone found himself smiling back, something that felt strange after the violence and tension of the siege. "Seems like we do." 3 weeks passed before the full weight of Blackwood's empire came crashing down. The territorial governor sent investigators who uncovered corruption reaching back 15 years. 23 families received their land back or fair compensation for what had been stolen. The judge and sheriff were removed from office and charged with conspiracy. Blackwood himself sat in a territorial prison awaiting trial, his influence evaporating like morning dew under a hard sun. Dry Creek began to change in small ways. Morrison expanded his store, hiring 2 more workers and stocking goods people had been afraid to ask for when Blackwood controlled the supply chains. The church was repaired properly and a new preacher arrived, a young man full of idealism and scripture who reminded Boone uncomfortably of himself at that age. The saloon still served whiskey, but the atmosphere was lighter, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. Jake Cordell was appointed sheriff by the territorial governor himself. He wore the badge with the same uncomfortable honesty he'd shown as deputy, determined to be the kind of lawman the town deserved. Doc Wheeler seemed younger somehow, the guilt he'd carried for 2 years finally beginning to ease. And Emma bloomed. That was the only word for it. She laughed more, spoke more freely, walked the streets without that hunted look in her eyes. She was talking about teaching school, about using some of the compensation money their family was receiving to help other young women in difficult situations. She'd found purpose in survival. Boone had planned to leave a dozen times, packed his gear, readied his horse, told himself the mountains were calling. But something kept him in Dry Creek, some thread he couldn't quite cut. He told himself it was practical. The territorial marshals needed his testimony for the trial. The town was still settling, still finding its footing. Emma and Clara needed time to truly recover. All good reasons, all true enough. But the real reason had auburn hair and eyes that saw through every excuse he made. Clara had taken over Morrison's general store, buying into partnership with money from her family's compensation. She ran it with quiet efficiency, transforming it from a dusty supply depot into something approaching a proper mercantile. And every time Boone stopped by, which was more often than strictly necessary, she found reasons to talk to him, to ask his opinion on stock or suppliers or the price of coffee beans. It was on a cool afternoon in October, with the aspens turning gold on the mountainsides, that Clara finally cornered him. "You've been saying you're leaving for 3 weeks now," she said, arms crossed, standing between him and the door. "When exactly is that happening?" "Soon," Boone said. "Need to get back before the first snow closes the high passes. The passes don't close until December. Better to be early than late." Clara studied him with that look she had, the one that suggested she could read every thought he was trying to hide. "Or maybe you're not leaving at all." "I'm a mountain man, Clara. The mountains are where I belong." "Are they?" She moved closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used. "Because you seem pretty comfortable here in town. Helping Morrison repair his roof, teaching Emma to shoot, having coffee with Doc Wheeler every morning. Just being neighborly." "Boone Thrasher." She said his name like she was scolding a child, but there was warmth in it. "You spent 10 years running from civilization because you were disappointed in what people could be. But these past weeks, you've seen what people can be when they stand together, when they find their courage. I've seen one town make one good choice. Then maybe that's enough. Maybe one town is all you need." She reached out and took his hand, a simple gesture that somehow carried enormous weight. "We need you here. Emma needs someone who'll stand up for what's right. The town needs someone who remembers what honor looks like. And I—" She stopped, and for the first time since he'd met her, Clara seemed uncertain. "You what?" Boone asked quietly. "I need someone who sees me. Not just as Emma's sister, or Daniel Ashford's daughter, or the woman who runs the store. Someone who sees Clara, just Clara, and doesn't look away." Boone found himself without words, a rare occurrence. He'd spent so many years alone, had convinced himself that solitude was what he wanted, what he deserved. But standing here with Clara's hand in his, he felt something shift inside, like ice breaking up in spring. "I'm not an easy man," he said finally. "I've got habits 30 years in the making. I don't talk much. I don't know how to be part of a community anymore." "Then learn." Clara smiled, and it transformed her face. "You learned how to survive in the mountains alone. You can learn how to live in a town with people who care about you. What are you asking me?" "I'm asking you to stay, at least through winter. See how it feels. If come spring you still want to go back to your cabin, I won't stop you." Her grip on his hand tightened slightly. "But give us a chance. Give yourself a chance." Boone looked past her, out the store window to where Emma was talking with Jake Cordell, both of them laughing about something. He saw Morrison sweeping his boardwalk, saw Pete setting up tables outside the saloon for the evening crowd, saw Mrs. Chen tending her herb garden with the same careful attention she gave everything. He saw a town that had found its courage, and in doing so, had found itself. "All right," he said. "Through winter. We'll see how it goes." Clara's smile could have lit the entire valley. She stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, quick and light. "Thank you." She released his hand and went back to her work, humming something that might have been a hymn. Boone stood there for a moment, touching the spot on his cheek where her lips had been, feeling something he'd thought long dead stirring back to life. Maybe she was right. Maybe one town was enough. Maybe one woman was enough. Maybe after 30 years of running, he'd finally found a place worth staying. The mountains would still be there come spring. They always were. But for now, for this winter at least, Dry Creek was where he needed to be. Boone picked up his hat, settled it on his head, and walked out into the afternoon sun. Emma waved to him from across the street. Jake nodded. Morrison called out something about needing help with a broken wagon wheel tomorrow, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Boone Thrasher felt like he'd come home.